Next day, their mother returns with something unexpected. Trapper finds 3 Comanche girls. The winter of 1868 had settled heavily over the wide plains, covering the land in a soft white blanket that looked peaceful but felt harsh and unforgiving. The sky was pale, almost colorless, and the wind moved across the open land with a lonely sound. Elias Boone had been living in this wilderness for many years. He knew how to read the sky, how to listen to the wind, and how to follow tracks pressed into snow. The land was quiet, but to him, it always spoke. That morning, Elias stepped out of his small wooden cabin before sunrise. The air was sharp and cold, biting at his face and fingers. He wrapped his thick coat tighter around his shoulders and checked the straps on his boots. Every movement was careful and practiced. He lived alone, and being careless in winter could cost a man everything. His cabin stood near a frozen creek surrounded by tall trees that had lost their leaves. Smoke slowly rose from the chimney, fading into the pale sky. Inside the cabin there was little comfort, just a small stove, a wooden table, a chair, and a narrow bed covered with animal hides. But to Elias it was enough. He had built it with his own hands. It kept him safe from storms and gave him a place to rest after long days outside. He picked up his rifle, not out of fear but habit, and began walking toward the line of traps he had set the day before. Each step made a soft crunch in the snow. The world felt empty, as if he were the only person left in it. He preferred it that way. Elias had never been a man of many words. He trusted actions more than promises, and silence more than noise. As he walked along the frozen creek, he kept his eyes low, studying the ground. Animal tracks told stories. A deer passing through at dawn, a fox hunting in the night, a rabbit hopping between bushes. He could tell how fresh the tracks were and where they were heading. This skill had kept him alive for years. But then he saw something that did not belong. Near a cluster of low bushes, the snow had been disturbed in a different way. The prints were small. Not hooves, not paws. They were human footprints. Elias stopped walking. He slowly bent down, brushing the thin layer of fresh snow aside with his glove. The prints were light and narrow. They were not made by heavy boots like his own. They were made by small feet, and there was more than one set. His heart began to beat faster. This land was known to belong to the Comanche people. Elias had always respected that. He stayed far from their camps and never caused trouble. In those times there was already too much fear and misunderstanding between settlers and tribes. A simple mistake could turn into something serious. He stood still for a long moment, listening carefully. The wind moved through the trees, but there were no voices. No horses. No signs of a larger group. The footprints were fresh. They had not yet filled with snow. Whoever made them was close. Elias followed the tracks slowly, his steps quiet and careful. The prince moved away from the creek and toward a patch of thick bushes near the edge of the woods. He noticed something else. The steps were uneven, sometimes deeper, sometimes lighter, as if the person walking was tired. Then he saw a smaller print beside the others. Children. A cold feeling moved through his chest that had nothing to do with the winter air. He pushed aside a thin branch and looked beyond the bushes. There, huddled close together, were 3 young girls. They looked up at the same time, their eyes wide with shock. For a second, no one moved. The world felt frozen in that small space between them. The girls could not have been older than 12 or 13. The smallest one looked even younger. Their dark hair was messy from wind, and their clothes were worn and dusty from travel. Snow clung to the edges of their garments. Their cheeks were red from cold, and their hands looked stiff. They were frightened. Elias felt it immediately. It was written across their faces. They pressed closer together, as if trying to disappear into one another. He slowly lowered his rifle to the ground. He raised both hands, palms open, to show he meant no harm. For many years, Elias had lived alone. He had faced storms, hunger, and wild animals, but standing there in front of 3 scared children made him feel something he had not expected: uncertainty. He did not know their language. He did not know how they had ended up there. He only knew one thing clearly. If he turned around and walked away, they would not survive long in this weather. The wind grew stronger, blowing loose snow across the ground. The smallest girl shivered. The oldest one stepped slightly in front of her sisters, as if trying to protect them. Even in fear, she showed courage. Elias slowly took a step back instead of forward. He wanted to give them space. He pointed toward himself and spoke gently. "My name is Elias," he said softly. They did not understand his words, but his tone was calm. He pointed toward his cabin's direction and then placed his hands together near his face, pretending to sleep. Then he wrapped his arms around himself and shivered dramatically, hoping they would understand that he had warmth and shelter. The girls looked at one another. The oldest whispered something in her language. The middle girl nodded slightly. The smallest one kept her eyes fixed on him. Elias waited. Patience was something the wilderness had taught him well. After what felt like several long minutes, the oldest girl slowly stood up. Her legs seemed weak from cold. She helped the smallest one to her feet. The middle girl followed. They did not smile. They did not speak, but they did not run. Elias turned his back slightly. Not fully. Just enough to show trust. He picked up his rifle and slung it over his shoulder in a non-threatening way. Then he began walking slowly toward his cabin, making sure not to move too fast. After a few steps, he heard it. The soft crunch of small footsteps behind him. They were following. The walk back felt longer than usual. Elias kept his pace steady, glancing back only once to make sure they were still there. The smallest girl stumbled at one point, and the middle one caught her arm. The oldest stayed alert, her eyes constantly scanning the land. When the cabin finally came into view, smoke still rising gently from the chimney, Elias felt a small sense of relief. It was not much, but it was warm. He opened the door and stepped aside, allowing them to enter first. Inside, the cabin felt warmer than the world outside. The stove crackled softly, giving off steady heat. The girls hesitated at the doorway before stepping in. Their eyes moved around the small room, taking in every detail. Elias closed the door quickly to keep the warmth inside. He moved slowly, taking a pot from near the stove and pouring some warm broth into 3 simple cups. He placed them on the table and stepped back. The smell of food filled the air. At first, the girls did not move, and the smallest one looked at the oldest. The oldest nodded gently. They stepped forward. Their hands shook slightly as they held the warm cups. Steam rose toward their faces. They drank carefully at first, then more eagerly. Elias watched quietly. He did not ask questions. Whatever. He did not move closer than necessary. As the warmth slowly returned to their faces, some of the fear in their eyes softened. They were still cautious, but they no longer looked as frozen as before. Outside, the wind continued to blow across the endless plains. Inside the small cabin, something unexpected had begun. Not a friendship yet, not even trust fully formed, but a fragile moment of humanity. Elias had started the morning expecting nothing more than checking traps and returning home alone. Instead, he had found 3 lost girls in the snow, and deep inside he knew that this discovery would change the quiet rhythm of his life in ways he could not yet imagine. The morning after Elias brought the 3 girls into his cabin, he woke before sunrise, as he always did. For a moment he forgot they were there. The habit of living alone was strong, but then he heard a soft movement near the stove, like someone shifting under a blanket. He opened his eyes slowly. The girls were still inside. The smallest one was curled up near the warm stove, wrapped tightly in a thick blanket Elias had given her. The middle sister was sitting upright, watching him carefully. The oldest was already awake. She was not lying down at all. She had stayed half sitting against the wall through the night, as if she did not fully trust her surroundings. Elias did not blame her. He slowly pushed himself up from his bed, making sure his movements were calm and quiet. The cabin was still dim, lit only by the fading glow of the fire. He added a few pieces of wood to the stove, and the room slowly filled with warmth again. The girls watched him closely. He nodded slightly at them, a simple morning greeting. They did not understand his words when he softly said good morning, but they seemed to understand the tone. The oldest gave a small nod in return. Elias stepped outside for a moment. The air was freezing, but the sky was clear. Fresh snow covered the ground again, soft and untouched. He looked around carefully. He knew something important. The Comanche people would not stop searching for their children. Families did not simply disappear into the winter wind. If these girls had wandered away or been separated from their group, someone would be looking for them. And if their people found them here, inside his cabin, they might misunderstand everything. Elias had lived near these lands for years. He had seen how fear could grow quickly between strangers. One wrong idea, one rushed judgment, and everything could turn dangerous. He stepped back inside and closed the door firmly. The girls had finished the last of the broth from the night before. Their faces looked a little healthier now, though still tired. Elias reached for some dried meat and bread from a wooden box and placed it on the table. He pointed gently at the food, and then at them. The smallest girl looked at the oldest again. The oldest hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. They began to eat slowly, still watching him carefully between bites. Elias sat at the table too, keeping distance, but showing that he was not afraid of sharing space with them. Silence filled the cabin, but it was not uncomfortable. It was thoughtful silence. After breakfast, Elias took a deep breath. He needed to decide what to do next. Leaving them alone here was not possible. Taking them to the nearest military fort did not feel right either. He had seen how soldiers treated tribal families. He did not want to place the girls in a situation where they would feel even more fear. The only choice that made sense was to try to find their people. But that would not be easy. He did not know exactly where their camp was. The Comanche moved often, following the land in seasons, and if he walked into their camp without warning, holding their daughters, they might not wait for explanations. Then he pointed toward the door and toward the distant hills through the small window. He made a walking motion with his fingers. The oldest girl's eyes sharpened. She understood he was thinking about moving. She stood slowly and walked toward the door. She looked outside, then scanned the land carefully. For a moment, something like hope passed across her face. That's just one clear gesture. West. Elias noticed it immediately. He walked to the door and opened it slightly. Cold air rushed in. He looked toward the west hills, where the land rose in soft slopes before disappearing into the distance. Was their camp there? He closed the door again and turned back to them. He needed to be careful. Traveling in winter was not simple, especially with children who were already tired. He motioned for them to sit again and held up one finger, then pointed at the ground, signaling that they would wait one more day. The oldest girl seemed unsure at first, but after a moment, she slowly nodded. That day passed slowly. Elias showed them small, simple things inside the cabin. He gave them extra blankets and dried their damp clothing near the stove. The smallest girl finally relaxed enough to sit close to the fire without constantly watching the door. The middle sister became curious. She walked around the cabin carefully, touching the wooden table, examining the tools hanging on the wall, studying everything. Elias allowed it. He understood curiosity. It was better than fear. At one point, the smallest girl smiled. It was brief and soft, but it was real. Elias noticed it and felt something warm rise in his chest. He had not seen a child smile in many years. His life had been filled with silence, snow, and survival. This small moment of light felt unexpected. But as the day went on, his thoughts grew heavier. He stepped outside again in the afternoon to examine the land more closely. The wind had calmed. In the distance, he thought he saw faint movement near the hills. It could have been animals, or it could have been riders. He knelt down and studied the snow. There. Hoofprints. They were not near the cabin yet, but they were within a day's ride. His heart tightened. The search had begun. He stood slowly and looked toward the horizon. If he waited too long, the riders might find his cabin first. That could lead to confusion. It would be better if he walked toward them openly, with the girls beside him. That evening, he prepared carefully. He packed some dried food into a small sack. He filled a water container. He checked his boots and wrapped extra cloth around his hands for warmth. The girls watched him in silence. The oldest seemed to understand. She helped her younger sisters tie their clothing more tightly against the cold. She brushed snow from their shoes and spoke softly to them in their language. Elias could not understand the words, but he understood the tone. She was comforting them. As night fell, they ate one more simple meal together. The cabin felt different now. Not just a shelter, but a place holding an unspoken agreement. Tomorrow they would walk west. Before lying down to sleep, Elias placed his rifle near the door, not as a threat, but as protection against the wild. He had no intention of using it unless absolutely necessary. The girl settled near the stove again. This time, the oldest did not remain fully awake. She lay down beside her sisters, though her eyes stayed open for a while longer than the others. Elias lay on his bed, staring at the wooden ceiling. He had always believed his life would continue in the same quiet way, trap, survive, endure the seasons alone. But now he realized something important. Sometimes the wilderness tests a man not with storms or hunger, but with choices. He could have ignored those footprints in the snow. He could have walked away. Instead, he had stepped forward, and now, as the wind whispered softly outside the cabin walls, he understood that the next day would shape more than just his own future. It would test trust between strangers. It would test courage. And deep down, he hoped that kindness would be stronger than fear. The third morning arrived with a strange stillness. The wind, which had howled across the plains for days, had finally grown quiet. The sky was clear, painted in pale blue, and the snow on the ground shone under the early light. Elias woke before the girls, but he did not move right away. He listened. Silence in the wilderness could mean peace, or it could mean something was waiting. After a few moments, he slowly sat up. The fire in the stove had burned low during the night. He added fresh wood and watched the flames grow stronger. The small cabin warmed again, and soon the faint smell of smoke filled the air. Girls stirred, one by one. The smallest rubbed her eyes and looked around, as if remembering where she was. The middle sister sat up quickly, alert as always. The oldest was already awake. She had been watching Elias quietly. Today was the day. Elias stood and gently motioned for them to prepare. He pointed west again, then made a walking motion with his hand. The oldest girl nodded. There was no fear in her eyes this time, only determination. They ate a small breakfast of dried meat and bread. It was not much, but enough to give them strength. Elias handed each girl a strip of cloth to wrap around their hands for warmth. Tense. He checked their shoes to make sure the cold would not hurt their feet during the journey. When everything was ready, he opened the cabin door. Cold air rushed inside, but it did not feel as harsh as before. The snow had stopped falling. The land looked calm, almost welcoming. They stepped outside together. Elias locked the cabin door behind him. He did not know how long they would be gone. For a moment he looked at the small, wooden structure that had been his whole world. Then he turned away. The girls stayed close as they began walking west across the open plains. The snow made walking slow. Each step sank slightly, and the cold air touched their faces. Elias walked ahead, but not too far. He wanted them to see that he trusted them to follow, yet he also wanted to guide the way. The oldest girl occasionally pointed toward distant hills, correcting his direction slightly. She knew where they were going. After some time, Elias noticed something in the distance, thin gray smoke rising faintly against the sky. He stopped walking. The girls saw it too. The smallest one gasped softly. The middle sister whispered something excitedly. The oldest girl's face changed. For the first time since he had met them, her expression showed clear hope. Smoke meant camp. Camp meant family. But smoke also meant uncertainty. Elias felt his heart begin to beat faster. This was the moment he had been thinking about since the day before. He knew that walking toward a Comanche camp without warning could be dangerous, but turning back now was not an option. He raised his hands briefly, signaling the girls to stay close and calm. They continued walking, slower now. As they moved closer to the hills, the land changed slightly. The ground rose gently, and the snow thinned in places where the wind had blown it aside. The silence returned, heavier than before. Then Elias heard it, a distant sound. Hoofbeats, soft at first, almost like a rhythm carried by the wind, then clearer. Then the girls froze beside him. From behind a low ridge, figures appeared, riders on horseback. They moved smoothly and confidently, like part of the land itself. Their horses were strong, their shapes tall against the bright snow. Within moments, Elias realized they were surrounded. More riders appeared from different sides, closing in quietly. There was no shouting, no rush, just controlled movement. The girls reacted instantly. The smallest one ran forward a few steps, calling out loudly in her language. The middle sister followed. The oldest stepped ahead of Elias and lifted her arms high, waving. The riders slowed their horses. One of them, a tall man with a calm but serious face, rode forward slightly. His eyes moved from the girls to Elias's. Elias did not reach for his rifle. Instead, he slowly removed it from his shoulder and placed it carefully on the ground in front of him. Then he raised both hands high in the air. The wind moved softly around them, carrying the girls' voices toward the riders. The oldest girl began speaking quickly and clearly, her words full of emotion. She pointed toward Elias, then toward the cabin's direction behind them. She spoke without stopping, her voice strong despite the cold. Elias could not understand her words, but he understood the meaning. She was explaining. The riders listened carefully. Their faces remained serious, but there was no sudden movement, no anger in their eyes. Only focused. Then, from the group of riders, an older woman moved forward on her horse. Her presence was powerful, not because she raised her voice, but because of the way others gave her space. Her hair, streaked with gray, moved slightly in the breeze. Her eyes were sharp and wise. The girls saw her and cried out at once. "Mother." The word was clear, even across language. The smallest girl ran forward fully now, her steps uneven in the snow. The middle sister followed. The oldest did not run at first. She turned once to look at Elias, just for a second. Then she too moved toward the woman. The older woman stepped down from her horse. She opened her arms. The three girls reached her at once, wrapping themselves around her tightly. She held them close, her hands gently touching their hair and faces, as if making sure they were truly there. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the wind seemed to quiet. Elias stood still, his hands still raised. After checking her daughters carefully, the woman looked up. Her eyes met Elias's. The moment felt heavy. She stepped forward slowly, leaving her daughters beside one of the riders. Her steps were calm and steady. Elias slowly lowered his hands but kept them visible. The woman said something softly to one of the men nearby. The man nodded and turned toward Elias. In broken English, he spoke carefully. "You found them?" Elias nodded once. "Yes," he replied quietly. The man listened again as the woman spoke more words. "She says they were lost 2 nights. Storm came. They could not find camp." Elias felt relief wash over him. So it had been a storm that separated them. The man continued, "She says, you give food, you give fire." Elias nodded again. "Yes." The older woman stepped closer now, only a few steps away from him. She placed one hand over her heart. Her expression had changed. There was no anger there, only gratitude. "I would be so happy." She spoke directly to him in her own language, her voice steady and strong. Elias did not understand the words, but he understood the tone completely. The man translated slowly. "She says, you saved her daughters." Elias felt a quiet warmth spread through his chest. He had not done it for praise. He had done it because it was right. He simply nodded once more. The tension that had filled the air began to fade. The riders relaxed slightly. The horses shifted calmly in the snow. The smallest girl looked back at Elias and gave him a shy smile. The middle sister lifted her hand in a small wave. Even the oldest girl allowed herself a soft expression of thanks. In that wide frozen land where fear often ruled first meetings, something different had happened. Trust had won. Elias bent down slowly and picked up his rifle, holding it peacefully at his side. He knew his part in their story was almost finished, but he also knew this moment would stay with him forever. Because sometimes the strongest bridge between strangers is not built with words. It is built with simple acts of kindness. The cold air still moved gently across the open land, but the heavy tension that had filled the space only moments before was slowly fading. The 3 girls stood close to their mother now, holding on to her as if they were afraid she might disappear again. The riders remained nearby, forming a quiet circle, their horses breathing softly into the winter air. Elias stayed where he was, giving the family space. He understood that this reunion was not something to interrupt. A mother who had feared losing her daughters forever was now holding them again. That kind of moment was powerful. It did not need words from strangers. The oldest girl spoke first. She turned toward her mother and began explaining everything in her language. Her voice was steady but full of emotion. She pointed back toward the direction of the cabin, then toward Elias. She moved her hands to show the cold, the storm, and the shelter. The middle sister added her own words, nodding quickly. The smallest one simply held her mother's hand and looked at Elias with wide eyes that now carried gratitude instead of fear. The mother listened carefully. Her expression changed slowly as she heard the full story. At first, her face had been tight with worry. Then it softened. Then something else appeared. Deep understanding. She stepped forward again, this time closer to Elias than before. The riders watched, but none of them looked angry. They were simply observing. Elias removed his hat out of respect. He stood tall but calm. His face showed no pride, only quiet humility. The mother placed one hand gently over her heart again. She spoke several words in a low, steady voice. Though Elias could not understand the language, he felt the meaning clearly. Her tone carried weight, sincerity, and strength. One of the riders, the same man who had spoken earlier in broken English, stepped closer. "She says," he began slowly, choosing his words carefully, "her daughters tell truth. You give them fire. You give them food, you walk them home." Elias nodded once. "They were cold," he replied simply. "Anyone would have done the same." The rider listened, then translated his words back to the mother. She listened closely. When he finished, she looked at Elias again, studying him not as a stranger now, but as a man who had shown character. The wind brushed lightly across the group, moving the edges of blankets and clothing. The winter sun was beginning to lower slightly in the sky, though there were still hours before dark. Then something unexpected happened. The mother turned and spoke to another rider, a younger woman who had been watching quietly. The younger woman nodded and rode a short distance toward the camp area hidden behind the hills. She disappeared for a few minutes. Elias wondered what was happening, but remained silent. The 3 girls stayed beside their mother, but the oldest stepped away briefly and walked toward Elias. She stopped a few steps in front of him. For a moment, they simply looked at one another. Then she placed her hand lightly against her chest and bowed her head slightly. It was a simple gesture, but full of meaning. Elias placed his own hand over his heart in return. He did not know her words, but gratitude needed no translation. After a short while, the younger woman returned. She carried something wrapped carefully in cloth. She dismounted from her horse and walked toward the mother, handing the bundle to her with respect. The mother accepted it and then turned slowly toward Elias. The riders grew even quieter. The mother stepped forward until she stood directly in front of him. She carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a beautifully woven blanket. It was unlike anything Elias had ever seen up close. The colors were deep and rich. Reds, blues, and earth tones blended together in careful patterns. The fabric looked thick and warm, made with skill and patience. It was not just a blanket. It was art. It was history. It carried meaning. The mother lifted it gently and held it out toward Elias. For a second he did not move. He understood that such an item was not given lightly. It represented respect and honor. The rider beside them translated again. She says this is from her family. For you, for saving her daughters, for walking them back. Elias felt his throat tighten slightly. He had lived alone for so long that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to receive something given from the heart. He slowly reached forward and accepted the blanket with both hands. Thank you, he said softly. The words sounded small compared to what he felt inside. The rider translated again. The mother listened and nodded once, but the exchange did not end there. The mother spoke again, longer this time. Her voice was calm but firm. She gestured toward the hills where their camp was located. She gestured toward Elias. Then she gestured toward the sky and the land around them. The rider paused, listening carefully before translating. She says, "This land is wide. Sometimes people fear each other. But today, you show not all strangers bring harm." Elias looked down briefly, then back at her. "I meant no harm," he said quietly. "Only help." The rider translated again. The mother's expression softened even more. She stepped slightly to the side and allowed her daughters to stand forward once more. The smallest girl reached into a small pouch tied at her waist. She pulled out a tiny bead, simple but polished smooth. She walked shyly toward Elias and placed it gently into his gloved hand. It was a small object, but she gave it with seriousness. Elias crouched down slightly to her level. "I will keep it," he said softly. The rider translated. The little girl smiled shyly. The winter sun dipped lower now, casting long shadows across the snow. The moment was slowly coming to an end. Elias knew he should return to his cabin before dark. The journey back would take time, and winter nights were not forgiving. He stepped back and nodded respectfully to the mother and the riders. "I should go," he said simply. The rider translated. The mother nodded in understanding. She raised her hand in a gesture of farewell. The daughters waved one last time, their faces no longer filled with fear, but with warmth. Elias turned and began walking back across the plains. After a few steps, he paused and looked back once after. The riders were slowly moving toward their camp, the mother and daughters together in the center. The winter light surrounded them in a soft glow. For the first time in many years, Elias did not feel completely alone in the world. As he walked, the woven blanket rested over his shoulder. It was heavier than it looked, not just in fabric but in meaning. He thought about how close the situation had come to misunderstanding. A single moment of fear could have changed everything. But instead, patience had led to trust. By the time he reached his cabin, the sky had turned shades of orange and purple. He unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin felt different now. Quieter. He carefully folded the blanket and placed it on the back of his chair. Then he took the small bead from his pocket and set it gently on the wooden table. He sat down slowly, staring at the fire as it crackled. Outside, the winter wind began to rise again. But inside the small cabin, warmth filled more than just the room. It filled his thoughts. He realized something important that evening. Kindness does not always change the world in loud ways. It does not always make history books. Sometimes it simply changes hearts. And sometimes that is more than enough.